What's up guys, PK here. Now I woke up today feeling somewhat reflective, yes, dare I say it, even adventurous. And so in today's video, we're gonna be throwing even more shit at the wall to see what sticks. Now this is actually a video I've been wanting to make for quite a long time, and I've been hesitant to do so because the difference between talking about philosophical, if you will, or I would dare say scientific concepts, and making video guides for YouTube guides for a video game, is that one of them really matters. You know what I mean? It's something I truly care about. For those of you that don't know, I have a background in physics, and I truly care. I love thinking about and talking about, conversing, discussing concepts about life, the universe. Where are we? Where did we come from? Who are we? Why are we here? So on and so forth, assuming those questions even make any sense whatsoever. But today, I want to talk about what is quite possibly the single most divisive subject, a sort of radioactive topic that I care about personally when it comes to how people feel about it, right? Because it's the concept of free will, or lack thereof, as I will argue for. Now, let me first state that I'm under no illusion that I'm going to convince anyone. I'm simply here to lay out my reasoning. I say my reasoning, it's not as if I came to all of these conclusions myself. Obviously, a bunch of it comes from stuff I've read and listened to. But how did I come to the conclusion that not only am I about as certain that free will doesn't exist as I am that evolution does exist? Like that's the level of certainty we're talking about. I would say it is, in my opinion, no more coherent to make a scientific argument for the existence of free will than it is to make a coherent scientific argument for the existence of God. Now, I can't prove to you that God doesn't exist. I also can't prove to you that free will doesn't exist, because in science you can't prove a negative. That is just how the world works. If something doesn't exist, you can't prove its non-existence. So I just want to make that clear. And as I said, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I just want to let you guys know how I view this, because this is genuinely something I spent thousands of hours thinking about. I mean thousands, okay? I like to sit by myself in my own thoughts and think about these things. It's something I've always done. Now, my argument is going to be threefold. And I'm winging this, got no script, no nothing, because as I said, I felt reflective today. So bear with me if I'm gonna edit a little bit, but bear with me if it's not the most cohesive video you have ever seen in your entire life. So let's start at the beginning, okay? What is free will? Okay, well, to me, if free will has to mean anything, then it has to mean that you could have done otherwise. Now, again, I'm thinking from a very physical perspective. That is to say, if I were to turn time back 10 seconds, right? Then to say that I had free will is to say that the sentence I just uttered would not necessarily come out the same way. That is to say that in a universe where I like chocolate and I like vanilla, and I chose chocolate, if I turn back time 10 seconds and I had to make the decision again, I could have chosen vanilla. Even though the exact same configuration of the universe was set up, somewhere by some mechanism that we call free will, I was the ultimate author of whether I ended on chocolate or vanilla, right? So there are obviously many sides to this argument, but let's start at the beginning. Determinism. Let's start by defining that. Determinism is the concept that we use in physics to describe the notion that if we knew, what is a theory, that let's say we knew every physical location of every particle, every subatomic particle in the entire universe, and we knew perfect descriptions of every physical law, every equation for every physical law in existence, right? If we knew those two parameters, which obviously I don't think we ever will, but let's say we did, right? Thought experiment. Then we could, with perfect precision, predict everything that is going to happen and has ever happened. Imagine a 3D simulation. We have all the right equations and all the conditions to perfection, then determinism would say that, well, then the universe is like a movie that you could play back and forth, a three-dimensional movie where everything is predetermined. That is determinism. Now, there are some people that would argue that you have free will, even if the universe is deterministic. But I have to say, if you make that argument, then I don't know what you're talking about. And I don't think you know either, because in a universe where everything is predetermined, then free will doesn't mean the same thing to you and me. Let me just put that out there. Okay, so then free will does not mean the same thing if you make the case that in a deterministic universe you have free will. So let's start there. Okay, but the universe isn't necessarily deterministic, as we know. Now, back in, I believe, the 80s, don't hold me up on this, there was an experiment made, which is one of the experiments that a lot of people arguing against free will use, but I don't think this evidence is very decisive, but I'll bring it up nonetheless, where they had test subjects sit, and they were shown, I believe, a bunch of, like, they had to make an arbitrary decision. I'll make it even simpler. I know this is not the exact experiment, but let me dumb it down even further here. Let's just say you had to pick left or right. That's it, right? You have two buttons, left, right, and you have a timer. And you're told that you can click left or right whenever you feel like it. There's no limits. There's no you could wait 10 minutes, you could wait 3 seconds. All you have to do is make a decision, and then you have to note when you made the decision. When did you come to? You can go left, right, no left. I'm gonna go right, no left. I'm gonna go. Nah, you know what? I'm gonna wait 10 seconds. I'm gonna go right. But when you make your final decision, you note the clock, right? And according to this scientific study, scientists measuring your brain, I should add, they have you in like they could measure your brain stimulants, and using an artificial intelligence, an algorithm, right, that studied your brain waves. Then after a while, after you've performed this experiment, going, okay, I'm going to go right here, I'm going to go left here. After a while, this algorithm, not unlike a search engine that is taught to recognize patterns, could recognize a pattern in your brainwaves that preceded the moment when you were cognitively aware of which decision you were going to make. In other words, I believe up as much as, don't hold me up on this, I believe the largest claim was like 8 seconds, but it doesn't matter. Before you were aware of the decision you were going to make, a scientist sitting in a lab behind you could go, he's going to pick right. And then 3 seconds later you go, I'm going to pick right. And then you pick right. Now, I don't think that's a very good argument against free will, actually. At least it's not the best argument, but that is one case that people will make, and that is sort of the first part of the discussion. But I don't think that completely rules out the existence of free will in of itself. But let's move on to the next path. Now, I talked a lot about this determinism, right? Now, the thing is, the universe, as far as we can tell at least, not necessarily, but as far as we can tell, is not entirely deterministic, because you have something like quantum mechanics, for example, and that introduces a level of, I don't like to call it randomness, because really it is what we call a distribution pattern, like where you have probability waves that are then determined when you measure them. But essentially, let's just call the randomness for the heck of it, right? Like, even if you could perfectly predict where that was going to be, as far as we know, that is not possible, because you have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can't perfectly know both the velocity and positioning of any given particle. But that's getting very technical here. Let's just say that there's randomness there. Okay, let's just make the argument that there's randomness there. But then you run into another problem, which is, how are you ever going to get free will from randomness? Okay, there is no combination of perfect predetermination and randomness that ever cohesively can come together to what you and I would in classical terms call free will, right? Because if it's random, well, then you didn't make the choice, right? Let me give you an example here to make it easier to understand. So a good argument, I think, or a good analogy against free will is that we can build simulations, right? Let's say that you have something like a Universe Simulator 2. Great game. Can warmly recommend it if you like to play around with planets and such. But it is, at heart, it is a simulation based off of the known laws of physics, right? Where you can have planets, you can pop in, you can have them collide, and then you have thermal reactions and sort of huge explosions, and you can sit and you can play around with your own little solar system or even entire galaxies, right? But at heart, it's a simulation based off the laws of physics. Now, just try to think about that for a moment. It is a simulation of what we know about the world. Now, if I were to ask you in this simulation, for example, to break the laws of physics, you could do that. You can take a planet and you can say, I wonder what would happen if it moved at 10 times the speed of light. Right? That is physically impossible. Yet in this simulation, you could do that. Right? You could literally break the known laws of physics in this simulation. Yet if I told you to get the simulation to make a decision, you wouldn't know where to start. Because it wouldn't make any sense. What does it mean for something to make a decision? Right? That has to lie at the core of what free will is. At the core of free will is decision making, right? Making an actual decision. So what is a decision? Because again, from the standpoint of physics, there has to be a point where we have to be able to narrow it down to say, okay, here we have this thing called free will. And part of that has to be a decision making. Now, you couldn't program in a decision. Now you might say, hold on, PK, what about AlphaGo, for example? For those of you that don't know, this is an artificial intelligence algorithm that first it beat the world's best chess player, it has beaten the world's best Go player. I believe they've also adapted it for StarCraft 2 and Dota 2 and a bunch of other games. But essentially it is a self-learning algorithm that's capable of playing against itself millions of times. They'll program in some basic instructions regarding the game it's playing. It'll then play a bunch of human players, it'll learn from them, and at a certain point you have a superhuman player, essentially, right? Now you might say, well, clearly it can make a decision, right? Because whenever you make a move against it in the game of chess or in the game of Go, well, clearly it pops out with a decision, right? It says, no, okay, you did that, then I'm going to do this. Is that a decision? Well, no, it's not. Because if you were to take the exact same conditions, that is to say, if you take the exact same version of AlphaGo, and you set up a game up, and you make the exact same moves in that game, then AlphaGo would come to the exact same decision 100% of the time. It is, in other words, deterministic, right? You could predict what it was going to do if you knew the conditions, aka there's no free will built into it. There's no decision making. There's a bunch of mathematics going on, probability calculations, a bunch of statistics, but it would always come to the same conclusion if you gave it the same initial conditions. In other words, there's no decision there. If I told you to program a decision, you wouldn't know where to start. And why is that? Think about that. We have a simulation where you can break the known laws of physics, yet if I asked you to put in a decision, you wouldn't know where to start. What does that tell us? Think about it. The most logical explanation for that, to me at least, is that the very concept of a decision from a physical standpoint is incohesive. It doesn't make any sense. It literally makes no sense. And I'll up you one further. Because as I said, I don't believe any combination of determinism and randomness doesn't give you free will, because if it's random, then you weren't in control. And if it's deterministic, then it was predetermined, aka you weren't in control. And so really, to invoke the concept of free will is to say that, well, it was determined, right? It was deterministic because I made the deterministic choice, right? I chose chocolate, not vanilla. That was my decision. In other words, I determined the outcome. Yet at the same time, we have to say that if we turn back the time to the decision, then it was not ever locked that you chose chocolate, because you could have chosen vanilla. In other words, it is invoking determinism and undeterminism at the same time. It's sort of mixture of saying that, well, you were in control, you determined the outcome, yet the outcome was not predetermined. It is incohesive, to say the least. I'll up you one further here, okay? So we know that electrical stimuli in the brain is what controls your actions, right? Well, we know this because we can stimulate parts of the brain with electrical stimuli, or we can even damage. We see that. Well, we're not going to damage, but we can see that when people damage a certain part of the brain, then certain cognitive functions no longer function, no longer work, right? And we can we can apply electrical stimuli in a certain brain part of the brain, and some people will hear music, right? So we know, as well as we know anything in the world, we know that electrical stimuli in the brain is ultimately what determines your actions, your cognitive function. It is what makes you do what you do, right? So for free will to be a thing, because what a lot of people will do when I come with the arguments I just gave here is to say, but BK, you can't know that there isn't some force, some, I hesitate to call it woo-woo, but I really lack a better word, something out there we don't know of, we haven't measured, we never, that affects your brain, causing you to make decisions, right? Or call it whatever you will, give it whatever form you wish, right? You can say it's outside the universe, inside, I don't care. Call it whatever you will. But you have to come to the conclusion, a reasonable person has to come to the conclusion that no matter what you put over there, right? No matter what you call this thing, no matter where you locate it in the multiverse, right? In order to affect your brain, it needs to, at some point in the chain of action, it needs to inherit a physical property. Now, when I say physical, I don't mean like, I'm talking in physicist terms. That is, physical just means like a photon is physical. It has energy. It's in our universe. It is measurable. Right? I would even go as far as to say that dark matter, as unphysical a thing as that seems, right? Because it literally, there might be trillions of them, of whatever particle it might be made of, passing through you right now, if assuming it is a particle. We don't know that for a fact, but it most likely is, but we don't know. But it nonetheless interacts with gravity, right? It interacts with the field of gravity directly. That means we know that it has a physical property because it's interacting with the physical world. And that is what I mean when I say at some point free will, somewhere in the causality chain, it needs to have a physical property. Now, why is that? Think about it. Why is that? Well, that is because in order to affect your brain, in order to affect the electrical stimuli that is the cause of your actions. We know that. Any reasonable person arguing that the electrical stimuli in your brain is not the cause of your actions, like, I don't even know what to tell you then, right? We can see when people are sleeping, we can see when they're awake, we can measure these things, and there's a very good reason why if you get a brain tumor in a certain part of your brain, you will be unable to talk, yet you'll be able to recognize words, and vice versa. Some people might be able to talk, but they don't know what to say. The studies here are very well done, right? So we know that the brain is what gives rise to your cognitive function. Now, in order for free will, anywhere in the quantum realm of the multiverse, right? No matter where it is, at some point in the causality chain, it has to inherit a physical property in your brain. That has to be somewhere in the causality chain where it interferes and affects your brain. Because if there wasn't, well, then it wasn't affecting your brain. And thus, it wasn't connected to your, you know what I mean? So there has to be somewhere in that causal structure where something physical happens in your brain. And at the moment you accept that there is something physical in that free will causality chain happening in your brain, that is the moment you also accept that it is inherently measurable. Which means it has to inherit a physical property in your brain that we can thus measure, that then gives, sort of affects whether or not you chose chocolate or vanilla, right? And that seems like a very incoherent thing when you think about it, right? Because again, from a physical standpoint, the whole concept of a decision, of a free will, literally makes no sense. You cannot map it onto the universe we live in. So unless you want to say that it exists in some quantum realm, and then somewhere in the causality chain, it has a physical property that affects your decision making in your head, but you would still have to be the author of that thing that was happening in the quantum realm universe, right? For free will to really be a thing, you would have to think your thoughts before you thought them. Because otherwise, you were not ultimately the author of your thoughts. Right? You'd have to think your thoughts before you thought them, which makes no sense. Right? That makes as little sense as the concept of free will. And when you pile all of these arguments together, like, I understand why people want free will to be a thing. It seems to come really close at everything we care about, right? Feelings like the feeling of being proud of something that you made. Like, I feel proud about my YouTube channel. I do. I put a lot of hard work into it. I am proud of that. But really, if I take a step back, I have to recognize that there's nothing really to be inherently proud about. Now, that might seem like a bad thing, but really it's not. And if you guys would like me to make a follow-up video, I'm going to tell you guys exactly why I think that the lack of free will is, to me at least, the single most, not just logically cohesive philosophy about how the world works, but it's also the most compassionate one. And if you guys would like to know why, you'll have to let me know in the comment section. Now, I'm more than open to, keep it well behaved, but I'm more than open to discussion and arguments. The thing is, the only reason I talk about this, and the only reason that I say it with such relative confidence, is that I've had this discussion with 1,000 people. I'm not kidding. It is one of my favorite subjects to bring up. I love talking about it, and I have never heard a single cohesive argument for the existence of free will, with the exception of the fact that it feels like we have it, right? And I'm all on board. I feel like I have it too, right? But we have to separate our first-person experience when we're talking about science and talking about an objective reality, right? And so, yeah, if you guys would like me to tell you why I think it is the single most logically cohesive and, in fact, most compassionate philosophy about the nature of the human mind, then like, comment, and subscribe! I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and as I said, feel free to disagree down in the comments. I don't mind healthy discussion. Keep it civil, though. And as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out!